Our first paper is about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots.
Too close.
All right.
Too accurate.
That's enough.
Yeah, so these are the, Josephus describes them as the four main offshoots of Judaism during the Second Temple period. And just to clarify what that is, that's from 550, you could argue it was either from 585 to or 515 BC is the start date. 585 is the destruction of the first temple and the Jewish exile into Babylon. 515 is when they rebuilt the second temple. So either one could be the start date of the if you determine if there's three periods with the exile, or if you just say there's first temple and second temple.
Solomon obviously rebuilt it, right?
Solomon didn't rebuild it. Solomon built the first one, though, that the Babylonians destroyed. This time, in Judaism, it sees the rise of the synagogue, because while the Jews were in exile, they couldn't go to the temple and make sacrifices like they did in Israel. And so the synagogue is where they go to worship, and the reading of Scripture kind of becomes their form of worship and what they do. As the Jews returned to Israel, they split into several different groups. Each one kind of claims that they're the true Israel returning, we're following the right rules, and you guys are doing it wrong. The most famous of these groups, and the ones recorded by the Bible and other sources outside of the Bible, are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Each of these groups had their own scribes, except for the Zealots. So the scribes were intermingled throughout them. The Zealots didn't really write much down.
Basically a paramilitary group.
And this period ends with the destruction of the Second Temple and an end with the sacrificial system forever. They've never rebuilt the temple because someone else built something on top of it. And sacrifices haven't been part of Judaism since the destruction of the temple. Another important group to talk about during this period are the Samaritans. During the Jewish exile, the Samaritans had their own temple at Mount Gerizim. I don't know. It's right there next to Shechem on the map, kind of in the middle of Samaria. So they were the split of the northern kingdom when Israel split into two different kingdoms. But once the Jews came back and built their own, had the Hasmonean dynasty in Israel, or in Judea, a Hasmonean king destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim, and the relations between the Samaritans and the Jews were already pretty strained before that, but like they were managing to coexist, and after that, it kind of completely fell apart. The Samaritans said, your new second temple is false, it's not, we're not going to go there, and all of the Jews in Judea were like, you guys aren't even Jewish, and that kind of continues to today. The Pharisees were the first of the main groups. This picture is from The Passion of the Christ, great movie, watched it last night. The term Pharisee comes from the Hebrew for set apart, or which is what they tried to do through following the laws in a very strict manner. Josephus claims there were about 6,000 Pharisees during his time. It wasn't every Jewish person, because he also refers to like the common man, but the Pharisees were the group that had the most support from common people. They differed from the common mainline Jews in two major ways. First, the Pharisees believed you had to observe temple purity laws at all times. So there were special rules about, hey, you have to like take a bath before you walk into the church or into the temple. The Pharisees said you have to maintain this cleanliness always. And then the other way they differed was they were strongly against any outside influence on Judaism. They said, we don't want any of your Greek theater, we don't want any of your Roman law, we don't want any of that. We're Jewish, we have our Jewish stuff, we're going to keep doing our own Jewish thing forever. They followed the oral Torah and traditions and interpretations of the law in addition to just what's written down, which the Sadducees did not. That was one of the main disagreements between the two groups. And they were also a bit more open to common people. So there's a quote that Josephus records that a knowledgeable, and he uses a Hebrew word that doesn't have a direct translation, but a knowledgeable, illegitimate child is better than an ignorant high priest. The word he uses means like a forbidden illegitimate child. So like if the couple couldn't marry because it was the product of adultery or incest, like someone like that who knows what they're talking about is better than a high priest who doesn't. Showing an attitude more in line with, hey, we should be educating everyone rather than the Sadducees who were more of the elite upper class and monarchist, actually, for the Jewish dynasty. And the Pharisees were what slowly became the rabbinical Judaism that we have today. Of the four sects, they're the one that really survives, and you can see what they did is what modern Judaism as a religious practice mostly follows. Yes, it follows more closely with the Pharisees than any other group, and it is very different from what the common people believe then because there is no temple now.
Their theology is more based on the Pharisees, right?
Yep. The Sadducees were the next group, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees together were the two most powerful of these groups. They were the upper class of Jewish society, and they supported the Hasmonean kings and other strong rulership, even though they weren't, the Hasmoneans weren't descendants of David, which was why the Pharisees didn't support them, because they're like, hey, you're not from David's descendants, you're not our king. And the Sadducees were the ones who maintained the temple. Their name comes from Zadok, the first high priest of the first temple, which also means to be right or just. They followed only the written Torah. They didn't follow any interpretations that were later written down. They didn't have the prophets, and they didn't have any of the oral traditions that went with it. They said, we're following what Moses wrote down, and nothing else. They also served in a lot of political positions throughout Jewish society because they were the elite. They were the aristocracy of what would be the equivalent to an aristocracy in other societies. According to Josephus, the Sadducees' religious beliefs were that there is no fate, God commits no evil, man has the free will to choose good or evil, the soul is not immortal, there is no afterlife, there's no rewards or penalties after death, you can't be resurrected. They didn't believe in angels or spirits of any kind. And that was a main disagreement they had with the Pharisees as well. Paul actually uses that in the book of Acts. He's like, you guys don't like each other, to run away from both groups really quickly because he brings up the resurrection. But they were able to work with the Pharisees, at least enough to form the Sanhedrin, which was like the high court of Jewish society. And this made them really the only two of these four groups to work together at all. The Zealots didn't like working with people, and the Essenes didn't like talking to people at all. This kind of shows a quick rundown of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees had the law, the Sadducees had the temple. Interpretations of the Torah, just the Torah itself, middle class, upper class, resurrection or not, afterlife or no, and the Pharisees did not like the Hasmonean kings. The Sadducees did. When the Romans invaded Jerusalem, the Pharisees actually opened the gates to let the Romans in because they said the Hasmoneans were unjust, and they stormed the temple and killed a bunch of the Sadducees inside when the Romans were invading. The Essenes were a third group. Josephus said they had about 4,000 people scattered across Judea. They didn't have any one major place where they were gathered. So they were smaller than the Pharisees or the Sadducees, but still a significant number.
Do the Sadducees support like Herod or something like that?
No, the Sadducees supported Herod, and before Herod, the Hasmonean dynasty descended from Maccabees, who led the revolt against the Greek empires who were ruling over them. Yeah, because they said any Jewish king, whether they're from David or not, is better than a non-Jewish king, and the Pharisees said, if we're not having a Davidic Jewish king, we don't want any Jewish king at all. The Essenes most likely broke off from the Sadducees in the face of the Sadducees' growing corruption in Jewish society. They lived celibate lifestyles, and according to Pliny the Elder, they had no money, and he said they existed for thousands of generations. They lived near the Dead Sea. We know that much about where they were. And Josephus says they immersed themselves in water every morning and ate together after prayer, but you weren't allowed to take the daily bath if you weren't repenting from your sins. They bear a pretty strong similarity to what the Bible says about John the Baptist's lifestyle, out in the wilderness, near the ocean, no money, but the difference would be John the Baptist, he has his disciples with him, but he doesn't really have a community of people who are following the exact same beliefs. And Christian monasticism is also pretty similar. The monks kind of copy this sort of lifestyle, and they probably wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. That seems to be the most likely source for who wrote them. And then there were the Zealots. They're a political group more so than a religious group. They believed different things about God, but what unified them was they hated the Romans. They started in 6 AD when there were new taxes that the Romans put in place, which is much later than these other groups came about. They were supported in their attempts at a revolt by the other groups against the Romans until the Zealots started killing everyone who didn't believe strongly enough in it. And it turned into a revolt against the Romans and a civil war at the same time. Imagine if the U.S. Civil War happened at the same time as the American Revolution. It wouldn't have gone well.
Fighting Britain and the South.
Right, fighting...
Like the Mexican Revolution.
Right, a lot like the Mexican Revolution. Which one? Well, there were a lot, and that's kind of what this turned into. The Zealots killed all of the apostate Jews and Sadducees that they could find during the siege of Jerusalem, and they burned all of the food and supplies that the city had because they said, we're not hiding inside these walls, we need to go out and fight right now. And they wanted to get everyone else to fight too, and then they lost when they decided to fight. There was a group called the Sicarii who operated for decades before the main revolt, stabbing people in crowds who supported the Romans or any Romans themselves that they could find, heightening tensions. No one really liked the Sicarii. Even a lot of the Zealots thought they were crazy because they weren't even going for a goal. They were just creating mass chaos most of the time they were doing anything. The Sicarii wanted a social revolution. They wanted a change in Jewish society, whereas the Zealots themselves were unified in that we want the Romans gone, whereas the Sicarii were just like, we want things to change, but we're just going to start killing people until they do. And they didn't really say what they wanted to change, so they just kind of killed everyone they could. A timeline of the Second Temple sects is the first temple is destroyed in 586 BC. The Jews go into exile. 535, construction begins on the Second Temple. It's completed in 515 BC. And then from 30 to 40 AD, and then a little while later with Pliny the Elder, it's in his natural histories, but we don't really know quite when he wrote it. We see the written accounts of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, John the Baptist, who was probably an Essene or related to them in some way, and the Zealots with, we see the term zealot showing up with Simon the Zealot, and Paul calls himself a zealot, or zealous for God, in the Gospels in the book of Acts. And then in 70 AD, the destruction of the Second Temple kind of sees an end to The Sadducees overall, because their whole thing was the temple and that's gone. The Zealots are all killed in their revolts. We don't really know what happens to the Essenes because there's not much written records of them, and the Pharisees go on to continue Judaism to what we know it as today.
All right, any questions?
Comments, well, like, if, like, the Zealots were, like, affiliated or, like, related to the Sicarii, said Polzina was a zealot, and that means, like, the Sicarii were kind of like terrorists, right?
Yeah, a good way to describe them would be terrorists. Well, assassins, the difference would be a singular target compared to the Sicarii just kind of did mass stabbings whenever a crowd was gathering. They weren't always getting high-profile people, just anyone.
And of course, the Sadducees were Sadducee because they didn't believe in the resurrection. All right.
Oh my word.
17 and the Tetrarchy.
Right, so this is kind of about Constantine's rise to power, which really did have a profound impact on church history, but it's also about the politics and wars that surrounded it, because it was a very complicated time in Roman history. So the Tetrarchy it basically means rule of 4 emperors, because there were 4 emperors. It started from 285 to 286, when the Emperor Diocletian ended the 3rd century crisis by splitting the Roman Empire into western and eastern halves. This is the beginning of the split into what people typically call the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, but I absolutely refuse to use the term Byzantine because that was made up by British historians. And no, seriously, that was coined by 18th century British scholars. But anyway, Diocletian, so in order to explain this, I kind of have to explain, there were different levels of emperor. There was an Augustus and there was a Caesar. Augustus was the high emperor, supreme, big cheese, what have you. And the Caesar was like a co-emperor, or an emperor who assisted the Augustus.
Soft cheese.
Sort of. I guess if you wanted, this is not a good comparison, but to get you an idea, picture a president and a vice president. And that's similar, but not exactly correct. Yes. But the point was, however, Diocletian did something completely different. When he split the Roman Empire into 2 halves, he made another person Augustus of the West, while he himself retained the title of Augustus of the East. And the man he chose to be Augustus of the West was a general named Maximian. And so he also promoted 2 other generals to be Caesars to serve him and Maximian. He promoted Galerius to assist him in the east, and he promoted Constantius to be Caesar for Maximian in the west. And in case you can tell by his name, Constantius was the father of Constantine. And anyway, so in about 305, however, both Galerius and Constantius were both elevated to Augustus after Diocletian and Maximian officially retired from politics. And from that, Constantius promoted a Caesar named Severus, while Galerius promoted another Caesar named Maximius, who would turn out to be problematic in later times. But that map right there shows the territory that was ruled by the 4 emperors. Constantius ruled Gaul and Britannia. Maximian ruled Italy, Hispania, and most of the North African coast. And Galerius ruled the Balkans, while Diocletian ruled Anatolia, the Middle East, and Egypt. And those are all pictures of statues of each of those guys. Very expressive. But anyway, so Constantius actually spent most of his time in Britannia, where he fought a lot of wars against the Picts up in the north. That's where Constantine got his early military experience as a young man and fighting with his father in the Roman army. But in 306, Constantius abruptly died in Britannia for causes unknown. Maybe he died fighting the Picts, maybe he just died of sickness or something. Maybe it was just a heart attack. But either way, his army in Britannia immediately elevated Constantine to Augustus of Gaul and Britannia. And this made Galerius very angry because it kind of subverted his authority. So instead, well, Constantine just sort of said, I didn't want this. I'm not trying to subvert your authority. They put this on me. So Galerius willingly and sort of graciously gave Constantine the title of Augustus, and then, well, actually, no, I got that wrong. He made Severus and Augustus and demoted Constantine down to Caesar, so that Constantine was serving Severus in the West. However, in that same year, Maximian and his son Maxentius decided to usurp power in Rome. And this caused a lot of confusion over the next few years as Severus and Galerius both attempted to invade Italy and retake Rome, but much of their army was bribed by Maxentius and Maximian and defected, and Severus himself was captured and executed in Rome. And Maximian and Maxentius were then able to firmly control the provinces of Italy and Africa, and Maximian even married his daughter to Constantine in order to secure Constantine's loyalty. However, Constantine did not openly support him against Galerius. Even though Galerius did not really like Constantine, Constantine did not really decide to he didn't really pick a side in this civil war between multiple emperors. But anyway, in 308, however, Maximian lost most of his power after he decided to usurp his own son, Maxentius. Reasons for that is not clear, but I guess he just thought Sonny was getting too strong. So in 310, Maximian also tried to usurp Constantine's rule in Gaul while Constantine was out in the eastern frontier fighting against the Franks. But Constantine quickly moved down south to stop Maximian's army, where he promptly defeated them, stripped Maximian of his power, and Maximian later hanged himself. So basically by 310, the remaining emperors were openly fighting each other after Galerius died. See, while they didn't really like Galerius, they respected Galerius enough to not be openly declaring war against each other while he was still around. But now that he was dead, they were openly fighting each other. Constantine took Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania, while Maxentius still had Italy. Licinius had the Balkans, and Maximius had Anatolia in the Middle East. And in 311, Maxentius declared war against Constantine directly in order to avenge his father, while Licinius was occupied, because Licinius was allied with Constantine, but he was busy trying to secure the Balkans. And so Maximius then also joined Maxentius because he believed that Constantine had breached his authority. So in 312, Constantine gathered the largest army he possibly could, which was really only about 40,000, and decided to invade Italy preemptively before Maxentius could strike at him in Gaul. And so it actually went really well for him. The first town he reached was Sagusium, which immediately threw open its gates to Constantine. He then captured the city of Taurinorum, where he destroyed an entire army of Maxentius's cataphracts. And then he captured the city of Verona, where Constantine killed the commander of the Praetorian Guard. And when he finally reached Rome, however, he had to cross the Tiber River. I tried to find a map of where there are multiple bridges across the Tiber River that lead to Rome, and the most northern one was the Milvian Bridge. Tried to find a good map, but couldn't really. But Maxentius, when he realized that Constantine was reaching the Milvian Bridge, decided to grab the garrison of Rome to stop him. Maxentius had the bulk of the Praetorian Guards, given that he was in charge of Rome. He also had the Imperial Horse Guards, which were the cavalry arm of the Praetorians, and had all of the urban cohorts of Rome. and also had taken many auxiliaries from Italy and North Africa. Constantine also had some Praetorian guards on his side, given that, he was Caesar and his father was an Augustus. But he also had a separate order called the Scutari Guards, who had mostly been serving in the western provinces. It is also believed that he had about at least 17 legions, as well as plenty of auxiliaries from Gaul. He also had a special classification of cavalry called the Vexillation, or something like that. And he also had the dreaded North African cavalry, who were probably feared among everyone else in the entire Roman Empire because of their incredible skills in horse warfare. But before the battle, however, Constantine is said to have received a vision of a great cross in the sky that had the Greek letters Chi Rho on it, which are the letters that spell Christ in Greek. And so he generally considered, even though he was a pagan, he still saw this as profound and ordered his army to paint Chi Rho on their shields. And so in order to get to Rome, they had to cross the Milvian Bridge, as I mentioned. However, Maxentius wanted to outflank Constantine, so he had his engineers build a pontoon bridge to the east of the main bridge itself. So the two armies finally clashed on October 28, 312, and it started when Constantine led his 1st Cavalry Division directly and attacked the vanguard Imperial Horse Guards and pushed them back, so that way it exposed Maxentius's right flank. Constantine's infantry then directly charged into the Praetorians, as shown in that picture there, and that just kind of became a stalemate, went back and forth as both sides clashed in a giant shield wall. And after that, however, Constantine's cavalry division on the right flank managed to rout the rest of Maxentius's cavalry, and so they now had Maxentius's Praetorian guards completely surrounded. And so after that, the auxiliaries and other legionnaires who had not engaged thus far panicked and ran back to the Tiber River, and all tried to swim across the Tiber, but they mostly drowned, including Maxentius himself. The surrounded Praetorians then attempted to make a final stand, but Constantine called off any further attacks and pardoned the Praetorians because he admired their bravery, and just basically said, hey, why don't you come work for me now? And so that was that. He won, and he was Constantine was then the undisputed ruler of Rome. So not long after that, Licinius got done with his campaign in Balkans, and he met with Constantine, and in 313 they officially authorized the Edict of Milan, which ended Christian persecution. And this was actually significant because 3 years earlier, before Galerius died, he had actually tried to get this through to end Christian persecution, but he died before he could get it through the Senate. And this was coming off what Eusebius called the Great Persecution, because Diocletian had directly tried to root out Christians far worse than any emperor before him. But now Christians had essentially had religious freedom and no longer had to fear institutionalized persecution. However, strangely, about 7 years later in 320, Licinius out of nowhere just reaffirmed his pagan faith and began persecuting Christians again in the East. I'm not sure why he did this. It's not really known why, but he just suddenly became ultra-pagan again. Then this, of course, led to another civil war between Constantine and Licinius. And Constantine eventually defeated Licinius after multiple battles. And when he captured Licinius himself, Constantine accused him of treachery and hanged him. And that left Constantine as the sole Augustus of the Roman Empire. And of course, he is considered to be the first Christian emperor, quote unquote. As I mentioned before, he authorized the Edict of Milan, and he also called the First Council of Nicaea, in which all of the bishops and church leaders met together to discuss a lot of theological issues, like including, the Trinity and spirituality and all kinds of things, where they came with a Nicene Creed where they affirmed belief in one God. And he also built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is believed to be the spot where Jesus was crucified. And even the interesting is he did this all while he was still apparently a pagan, but towards the end of his life he officially converted to Christianity and was baptized by Eusebius. And even in death, however, Eusebius refers to Constantine's reign as the Great Deliverance because he, well, brought the Christians out of an age of extreme persecution. And I guess it's kind of similar to how Cyrus brought the Jews out of their exile from the Babylonians. And those are my sources.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments? Very good. Nice job. Yeah, Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian, so this is probably where he got some Christian.
Okay. So like earlier on you said like the term Byzantine was coined by a British scholar, so like if you don't call it Byzantine Empire, then like what would you call it then?
What?
Remember?
Say it, word that again.
Remember earlier in your presentation you said how 18th century British historians coined the term Byzantine Empire?
Yes.
So if you don't call it like Byzantine Empire, what do you call it then?
Eastern Roman Empire. By the course, the people who lived there just called it the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Yes, so his mother had a lot of influence on him, and she also traveled through what we would call the Holy Land and identified several holy sites, which were then, we then see
Eastern Roman Empire.
that those become holy places, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, and so on. Several other churches built there. So it really, you could say that was the influence of his mother, I think, on him, and as well as his mother, say, on the building of these holy places. Yes?
I've always wondered with some of the sites in Israel, do you think 300 years or so later is like a close enough timeline where, say, like locals in Jerusalem would remember where the sites happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, they are traditional sites. So, yeah, but I mean, I think people have a memory of things, and, you're talking, let's say, not quite 300 years, but there have been Christians in the area the whole time. So I think some of the sites are, I always tell people they have been considered to be the places for, 1,500 years to 1,800 years. So they should really be taken seriously. Whether I can say absolutely or not. And, it's very hard. Like, say, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the building has been there for so long, and when you go in, it doesn't look anything like what you would imagine a garden tomb or a hill of Golgotha to look. But, like I say, I think I've told you in here, when I take people on tours and trips to the Holy Land, I usually invoke my 1 mile rule. So I say, within a mile of here, this happened. So I think that's pretty good. Okay, we have a paper now, a presentation on women in the early church.
Okay, so this might look a little familiar to one I did previously this semester, but it's a little bit different. It's going to focus more on the roles women play specifically in the church of the time. So we know there are several scriptures regarding to women teaching or what they did, and there could be different interpretations about that, and a lot of times controversy that comes with it. So we're not going to focus on that so much, but what we actually do know about the women who were in the church. And regardless of what viewpoint you take, you can't deny that there were women in the New Testament that did contribute to the early church. And in fact, the early church was full of women. As we learned earlier this semester, many Greek and Roman families practiced exposure, so they would abandon their infant baby girls oftentimes because whereas their sons could be heirs, the daughters would require dowries, so they tried to limit it, as we learned earlier, to just one daughter. Of course, I'm sure that wasn't the case with every single family, but it was quite common. Whereas Jews and Christians were against exposure, so just from that fact alone, we can assume there were many more women in their circles as opposed to the Greek and Roman families. And Jews and Christians also held a higher view of women. They knew that they were created in the image of God just like men. And I think the way the church treated women was often followed the example of Jesus himself, because the way Jesus treated women in the New Testament was counterculture to the time. One significant example could be the woman at the well, and that was significant because it wasn't just the man approaching a woman in public, it was a Jew interacting with a Samaritan. Those groups normally didn't interact. And then you also have the woman who was caught in adultery and the sinful woman that came and anointed him with the perfume. So he also had a group of women that followed him throughout his ministry, as indicated in the book of Luke. And they were present there at the crucifixion, for the burial, and were some of the first to realize that he had risen from the dead, and were the first to tell others about that. So, but after Jesus ascended into heaven, the women still served in the church. And there are a few scriptures regarding teaching and speaking, but we won't really go into that because there are different interpretations that you can take. Some say it's dependent on the culture, others would say it's just in that particular church there was an issue. But we do know that women could teach other women, as indicated in Titus 2. And there's evidence that women could prophesy and pray aloud in church. And Philip had 4 daughters, as indicated in Acts 21, who prophesied. As far as specific examples go, Paul mentions in Romans that Phoebe was a deacon at the church in Centuria, I believe is how it's pronounced, and it is likely that she delivered the letter to the church of Rome from Paul. And the word that is used...
That's one of the harbors of Corinth.
Okay, that's why that makes sense. And the word for deacon is diakonos, which could translate to runner, messenger, or servant, which goes along with our understanding of what Phoebe's role was. And as far as what would have been required for deacons at that time, it's not completely clear, because the instructions that were given in 1 Timothy, that book was written, or a letter was written after Romans, so we're not sure that what he said for deacons, both male and female, in 1 Timothy would have necessarily applied in this case. But in the letter to Rome, he greets in chapter 16 several people, and there are several women mentioned in that list. The first one is Priscilla, who along with her husband Aquila were tent makers, and they're originally from Rome, but they had to leave because Emperor Claudius had given an order expelling all the Jews from Rome, so they moved to Corinth, which is where they met Paul, and they all worked as tent makers there. But then they moved to Ephesus, and they set up a house church there, and they met Apollos, who, as we know, was an evangelist during the early church, but he was still a little confused on some things in regards to the gospel, so they straightened him out gently in that way. But,
And, her name is always listed first.
which was significant because it might mean that she may have held a higher position in society than her husband, because usually the husband's name would come first, but if the wife's name came first, then that she probably held a higher position. And another woman would be Lydia, who we meet in Philippi, and she was the first person that Paul and his team met there. And after being converted, she was a purple cloth dealer, which meant she was probably very wealthy, but she and her household were converted to Christianity, and after being baptized, she immediately invited Paul and his team into her home. So as soon as she became a Christian, she started serving others, which could be a good example for all of us today, that, it's not like, oh, yay, I'm Christian, cool, and then, several years down the road, you start doing things for the Lord. It's like she immediately started serving others. And her hospitality, in a way, paved the way for the church of Philippi, because they were the first people that Paul met there, and that would later on become Paul's favorite church, as we can assume from the way he wrote the letter to Philippi. And there were several other women, many of which were mentioned in Romans 16. Junia was imprisoned with her husband Andronicus, and Paul, most likely for sharing the gospel. Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis all worked very hard for the Lord. What exactly this work was, Paul doesn't indicate, but we can assume it was probably evangelical in nature. Euodia and Syntyche, we don't know much about them, but there must have been some sort of dispute, given the way Paul wrote that they needed to be of the same mind. And so they may have been had some sort of leadership role there in Philippi. Nympha, I think it was Colossians, that says she hosted a church in her home in Laodicea. And Lois and Eunice were, of course, the grandmother and mother of Timothy, who got a special shout out in the 1st or 2nd Timothy, I believe, for passing their faith on to him.
A shout out. Okay.
So obviously the Bible's a great source for information about the early church, but there are extra biblical sources that can also provide us with information. The Shepherd of Hermas talks about Grapte, who was, I think she teach the widows and orphans in her community. And while she's not specifically referred to as being a deacon, her role is very similar. And the source where I found this particular story, it was a book called Ordained Women in the Early Church, and they talked specifically a lot about female deacons during that time. And they said that female deacons were common in churches in the East. And I have a map here. It's not the most accurate to the time period that we're covering, because you can see it goes into the 600s and 800s. But I believe from, is it like Germany on over, would have been the east side, whereas this way would have been the west.
well, from like Thrace, right in there. Like we're the yellow line for Germany, pretty much coming down.
Okay.
Thrace, Asia Minor, Egypt. Yeah.
So female deacons were much more common over there, whereas you didn't hear about it at all on the western side until the 5th century. And this course, I believe, we're only going through the 4th century, so we won't go into the Western Church. But according to the apostolic constitutions, which were from Antioch or Syria, I believe, which were given regulations and guidelines for the church so that way there's more order in the church, they had several rules for the female deacons, and it indicated they were responsible, as we can imagine, for caring for the other women of the church. And one I thought was interesting was that a woman just in general couldn't approach a male deacon without a female deacon accompanying her, which is kind of similar to how you hear today about a lot of pastors won't meet with a woman in public without somebody else with them, or, they won't meet with one in private. And usually just for the book would say for confidentiality or accountability reasons. The female deacons were also not allowed to teach or baptize, and there were a lot of rules in regards to baptism, but I'm not going to go into all those. And then this one, I believe it was Brian who did the presentation on households, I think, and then they have a specific section in the homes just for the women, like the women's quarters. So as you can imagine, probably wouldn't be appropriate for Paul or Barnabas or somebody to go and hang out in the women's quarters and share the gospel. So they would bring female companions along with them. In some cases, it may have been their wives. So that way the gospel could go into the women's quarters, and they would also get to hear about Jesus, and that was a way they could share with the women without there being any sort of scandal. So obviously there's a lot more information out there that I could have touched on, but I'm not the most knowledgeable on this particular time period, so it's been harder to discern fact from fiction. And as we can learn from reading Eusebius, some of the details even from that time period aren't completely accurate too. So I just decided to cover what I did know from scripture and then from a few other sources. But what we do know just from these is that I thought was a good lesson to learn overall is every spiritual gift is just as important as another, so you don't necessarily have to have a platform to be impactful for the gospel. I mean, many of these women, they just opened their home to others, and yet here we are talking about them several hundred years later, and that helps to spread Christianity in the early centuries. So,
All right, thank you. Any questions or comments? One? Okay.
So in that regard, what is your response to feminists who say that Christianity oppresses women?
I was expecting this question. I'm actually not really one way or the other. Honestly, I'm more of like a behind the scenes kind of person, so I'm not too passionate one way or the other. I think, like with Alex Seeley, she came for conference, and I think many of the guys in here might agree that they learned something from her. So if I can learn from a guy, maybe y'all can learn. But as far as a biblical stance, I'm not really like one way or the other, honestly.
But no, it's not what I was asking.
Okay.
My point was, what is your response to people who say that Christianity oppresses women? I wasn't asking what your personal thoughts are. I just wanted to ask what's your response to that.
That would probably be that in church setting or in family settings or just in general. That's a hard one because, from a Christian understanding, talking to other Christians, it's easy to say. Like you say, well, God created women in the image of God just like he created men in the image of God, and he loves everybody and has given us all the same spirit, gives the same gifts to everybody. But if you're talking to a non-Christian, that can kind of be hard to explain if they don't believe in God or the Holy Spirit. So that one's definitely one I have to think about some more.
Okay, fair enough. Anything else? All right, thank you. Very good. Well, yesterday was Easter. There's one thing we can say for sure. The very first Easter morning message was delivered by two women. So we can't say that much, right? Guys didn't believe them. So they had to go check for themselves. That does sound like guys, right? What? Hey. You're trying to take my joke. That's all right.
I think we were just on the same page.
What? Okay. How about Decius?
That's me. If this isn't working
No?
out, yes, it's me. But if this PowerPoint is broken, for some reason it always is, I also did some
All right, let's see if it will work. He's very prepared. And he's not even a Boy Scout.
It's just every single time that I sent it before, it would always be the image would be all corrupted and weird.
Okay. Decius and the persecution of Christians. Come on down and tell us about persecution.
So, I was really interested. Dr. Wineland mentioned Decius kind of in passing during one of our classes and how he persecuted Christians. But when I actually researched it, it was a little more complicated than that. I was kind of interested in what the background and the actual execution of the persecution was designed to be. So, yeah. So, first, a little background to why this began. The Roman Empire from 200 AD was kind of waning. It wasn't really as strong as it was before, and many leaders wanted to find solutions for the decline in the morality, or what they viewed as the morality and the strength of ancient Rome. And typically these leaders were conservative, and that doesn't mean conservative however we think of it. It usually just means that they were really nationalistic and they didn't really want change to happen, or they wanted to go back to a set of values that the empire adhered to before. So this was good if you were conservative in ancient Rome, but it was bad for groups that disagreed with the leaders in any way whatsoever.
If you were liberal.
Well, you don't even have to really be a liberal. You just, in ancient Rome, you could just be someone who maybe didn't want a strong centralized rule of law.
Really, I'd just like to point out it really isn't accurate to put our modern political terms to those times because it doesn't match. There's so much
it's a whole different mindset. This is just the closest word we have to the kind of politics.
Like, for example, Roman conservatives were completely okay with open practice of homosexuality. Yep.
Thank you, Adrian.
Let's keep moving.
So here's the man of the hour, Decius. He doesn't look so great. He looks a little upset. I am also a little bit upset. So he's born between 190 and 200 AD, and not much is known about his upbringing other than he was born to some pretty wealthy people. He became a consul in 232 AD, and he was a pretty good Roman military leader. At least the people under him were good leaders, and he kind of just employed the right people. He embodied a lot of the Roman traditionalism and conservatism that I talked about earlier, which is piety and strong nationalism and believe in a strong hands-on government. And I got a really interesting quote from the University of Michigan. It is from an archived site because the site doesn't exist anymore as it did with this document. And they know that the Emperor Decius was a curious figure. The evidence of his actions suggests that he was deeply conservative, that he was deeply pious, that he was possessed by a ferocious temper, and that he was quite stupid. So, yeah, so he had some successful military adventures, but he was apparently not character-wise very bright, and he was prone to fits of anger. So he was also a little bit, I'll actually move this onto the next page. He was also a little bit conceited. In this bust of him, he had himself designed to be like Mars. And he also renamed himself Trajan after another Roman emperor rather, who was much better than he was. So he wanted to revive the ancient glory of Rome, but he soon discovered that it was impossible to replace the greatness on a permanent basis without restoring public virtue, ancient principles and manners, and the oppressed majesty of the laws. And I was kind of trying to see if he was like so conceited that he didn't even practice the virtue that he wanted everyone else to have. So I tried to look up some biographies on him, but it was a little difficult because he died really fast. Like only 2 years after becoming emperor, he died. So it's not easy to see if in his private life he was also really virtuous. But he did revive this position that had been kind of removed from the Roman Empire called the censor. And the purpose of the censor it was kind of originally to deal with like the funding and the census, or the plural census of Rome, but he kind of expanded the power to also make them have the ability to enforce morality on people. And one of the things that he had the censor enforce was this idea of supplicatio, or enforced supplication to the gods, or enforced sacrifice to the gods. So Decius thought he could repair the Roman Empire through the use of this censor. And he gave his position to this guy named Valerian, who was originally going to be the Roman emperor after Decius, but he got like, not succeeded, but like a guy named Gallius took his place instead. So, hold on, let me check something really quick. So yeah, down in that quote right there, that's just a little bit more of the kind of things that that the censor's job is to manage the citizenry and the taxes and the empire. But what is most important and what's most pertinent for this class is the religious aspect of it, and the persecution. And it was this concept of the libellus and the libelli, which is you had to have a written document certifying that you sacrificed to the Roman gods. And that resulted in a lot of persecution of Christians. So, like I mentioned before, you were supposed to perform a sacrifice in front of a priest and some witnesses. And then you'd be signed a libellus, which would certify that you had sacrificed and that you were good to go for however long until the next period of sacrifice. But this created a problem with the Christian church, because if you didn't sacrifice, you were killed. And being monotheists, Christians couldn't just sacrifice and not mean it, or else they would be denying their God. So there was only a few options left for Christians, which was either to blaspheme, to die, to deceive authorities, or to evacuate. So the most obvious consequence of avoiding the sacrifice or denying the sacrifice was just you died. Anyone who did not get a libellus and the confirmation of multiple witnesses was put to death. Now this is kind of interesting. I was trying to see what the actual execution was, if it was just like you got your head cut off or if you were tortured, and it was kind of like it was kind of difficult to find, because there's Orthodox and Catholic traditions that hold that Christians were tortured, like they were dragged through streets on horses and then eventually hung or beheaded. But all we know for sure is that you just died if you didn't do the sacrifice. And the next option was deception. And this was just if you faked your libellus, if you got somebody to forge one for you. And this, you didn't have to deny God because of it, but you did have to lie to authority, which introduced another little area of sin. And if you ever were found out for lying to authority, well, then you're just back in the original boat of being killed. And then there was blasphemy. And this is one of the areas that caused a huge rift in the church, which was these people did the sacrifice, but they just didn't mean it in their heart. They did it disingenuously. But that caused a lot of bishops to think, well, if you could just be fakely or fake sacrificing to these gods, how do we know you're really following our God? How do we know that it isn't just all for show? And the final option was to just evacuate, just run into the wilderness, wait it out, which just, kind of worked. It didn't take that long, only 2 years. And Decius died. So in this, you did not have to deny Christ, and you did not have to lie to the authorities. However, there were often these Christians who, after living in this wilderness and the conditions, just felt that it was not fair that many bishops were allowing people who denied Christ and sacrificed to these gods to be let back into the church. So it wasn't like they were free from sin either. They often got pretty conceited. But none of this really mattered because, as I've mentioned a few times, Decius died really quick. He was killed by Goth forces 2 years after becoming emperor. And a lot of his loyalists, too, because he'd bring around his legions with him. They also were killed by Goths. So there wasn't really anyone to enforce this libellus law anymore. And immediately the Senate's like, okay, we're done with this. Let's just get rid of it.
Christians saw it as God's work.
Yeah. And another thing, this law caused great discontent throughout the empire because it was not written to specifically target Christians. It was a horrible Christian persecution, but it was also a horrible, Egyptian persecution, or any cult that did not worship the right way, or maybe had a stronger belief in a different kind of God. So,
How many do you have left?
just that.
Okay.
Okay, sir.
All right.
Okay, good.
All right, we better end it.
Are you sure you don't want me to read that whole quote? Are you sure I could do that right now?
No, that's all right.
Only if you can wrap it.
No.
We'll put it online and everybody can read it. All right, thank you. Remember, by the way, today at 3 o'clock, right across the hall, we have extra credit available. We have a special speaker at 3 o'clock, 2:30, yeah. All right, we'll see you then.